Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be on this Touch a Life project and program to talk to you about a particular subject that I've been asked to talk about, which is the voices of the poor. Uh, I I thought of this title because it's appropriate to what Touch a Life Foundation does. It's also the title of a book that Deepa Narayan of the World Bank wrote in the year 2000, where they did several thousand interviews to try and understand the voices of the poor. Now, this is an important topic because if the voices of the poor are important but are not being heard by those who work for them, then those who work for them might come up with solutions that don't really fit the needs of the poor. Let me start with an example of my own. In the mid 1980s, I was part of an NGO run by the Aga Khan Foundation that operated about 50 preschool facilities in rural Gujarat, targeting the very poorest of the poor. We called our program the Daycare Center Program, or DCC program in short. The children attended from 9 in the morning till 3 p.m. They were from 2.5 to 5.5 years of age. And it was a culturally appropriate program taught in the local language Gujarati. Now, when we looked at the impact of the program some years after it began to see how well it had prepared children for school, and what was the attendance rate versus the dropout rate and other parameters of impact, we measured some noticeable things. One is that those daycare centers which offered low quality nutritional inputs, because obviously we served a meal during the day and snacks for the children, those DCCs that offered low quality nutritional inputs could not compete even with the government run preschools. So we concluded from that that parents cared more about the meals than the education because they were poor and could not afford adequate nutrition at home. The second thing we found is that those daycare centers which employed a head teacher from the village attracted more children to the daycare center than schools that employed a teacher from the city, from the nearest urban area. And we did that not for any other reason except that the teacher from the urban area was usually much better trained. So we thought we could do a better job of providing educational inputs. But what we found was that the schools where the head teacher was from the local village, from the village itself, attracted more children than when we employed a head teacher who came from outside. So we concluded that parents were more interested in the babysitting aspect of the preschool in a safe environment with a local teacher whom they knew than about education. Now, when we looked at the children and what they did when they graduated from the preschool and went on to primary school, although our schools, our children recorded a higher attendance rate at primary school, about 80% of them went on to primary school. Remember, in those days, schooling was not compulsory. And so about 80% went on to primary school. So there was a 20% dropout rate. But still, it was higher than the government preschools, which recorded a primary attendance rate of 60%. These are, of course, all government owned schools because private schools in those days were not allowed. They could only provide supplementary tutoring, or as they were called in those days, tuition classes. So we concluded that the reason there was a dropout at the age of 6 years old when they entered at the primary school was because the children could be useful at home. And so the parents who were poor and needed to go out for work kept the children at home so that they could look after the even younger children in the house, because the average number of children in the house was 5 or 6 in those days. What we found, the next finding we found was that there was a steep dropout rate when the children entered pre-secondary school, that is standard 6 to 8, and even more in the secondary school, where the dropout rate reached 70%. And by that time, there was no difference in the dropout rate between our students and the government-run preschools. And again, we concluded that this dropout was because children were at that age old enough to work in the fields or help with household chores. So the parents didn't want to send them to school. Now, it turned out most of these conclusions were wrong. Yet we were comfortable in those conclusions because they were exactly the same conclusions that were held by the World Bank and other agencies such as UNESCO. The picture that emerged from our experience and from that of the World Bank and UNESCO is that food on the table was more important than education, which you can call food on the table tomorrow. And so we concluded that parents did not realize the value of education, the poor parents. Fortunately, at that time, we decided to take the trouble to find out why. So we surveyed about 400 of the poorest households across the 50 villages. Initially, we met with the heads of the households who were all men, and they tended to agree with our conclusions. One day, though, I remember a woman followed us out of the meeting room. She had been sitting at the side and she hadn't spoken much during the session itself. She came up to us and said, "Look, I would sell my jewelry if the proceeds can buy a good English language education for my children." And that got us thinking. And then we did a lot of further inquiry and we did a lot of sessions with the women and realized that for these women, what education meant was a way to get the children free from the constraints of the village. They saw limited opportunity of living in the village. They wanted to educate their children in a way that would make them able to work in another location when they grew up. And to them, that correctly meant the English language. They also valued a good education. We found out that the lower attendance rate when a teacher from the urban area was hired was because the teachers themselves didn't show up for class. They didn't want to travel from the urban area to the rural areas. So the children felt unsafe about their children at the time. So after a lot of study, we realized that the same thing was happening in primary school. The dropout rate was again due to teacher absenteeism, not a problem of the parents of the children wanting the children to work in the house. And we concluded that the priority was quality of education, safety, and nutrition, not the other way around. Now, in our case, we were able to fix this problem quite easily. We added English classes as a separate subject. We focused on local teachers, we monitored absenteeism, we gave good meals, and attendance soared. But it took the World Bank and the UN and UNESCO and other agencies another 2 decades to learn, as the book by Deepa Narayan that I mentioned, Voices of the Poor, showed. That was in the year 2000. And so many lives were wasted, the opportunities were wasted during that time. Now, why is it that we do not know the voices of the poor? It is not because the poor are unaware of their needs. In fact, they are more aware of it than we are. Nor is it because the poor are unaware of how to fulfill their needs. They know that better than us too, for they are constantly searching for ways to improve their lives. The problem is that despite knowing the goal and how to get there, they lack the resources to get there. And what do I mean by resources? Obviously, money is one, but the main resource they lack is time. The poor are extremely busy earning a livelihood and do not have time to waste. An hour lost to a power outage or a crowded bus system reduces the food on their table. So that's why many NGO programs fail, or even government programs. They come up with programs, for example, to train the poor and give them loans to start a business. That's the last thing that the poor want. They don't have the time for the training. It's very valuable time that they're sacrificing to take such training. And secondly, they don't want to take debt to start a risky business. They want safe income, even if it's less income. They're already heavily in debt. So I hope you're getting a sense of what I mean here. I'm going to read out to you a personal experience of running a farming business in Maharashtra in a district called Karnala, which is near Mumbai city. This was in the mid 1980s where I had set up a greenhouse to grow tomatoes. And this is my story. Just give me a second to find it. This is the book, India Arriving. It's my book that was published about 15 years ago. So this was the story is that at the time when I was growing these tomatoes, harvesting season was coming up. And one day in April, my main farmhand, Hasuram, asked for a few days off. Since we were about to begin our tomato harvest the next day, I asked him if he could wait a few days. He said no, he could not do so as he had urgent work on hand. Now it emerged that the local money lender, who was also the area's largest landowner, needed Hasuram to help him harvest his own land. The moneylender also planned to recruit several other villagers for the purpose, many of whom were beginning to harvest their own rice crops. This seemed like the worst time to offer one's services to the moneylender. Were they paying off their debts to the moneylender in this way? I wondered. Oh no, said Hasuram, we don't charge for this service, we give it for free. He added, we'll never pay off the moneylender's debt. It turned out in further conversation with him that the moneylender regularly took the season's best days for sowing and harvesting from Hasuram without payment. The interest the borrowers paid him, a 15% rate, was separate. Hasuram told me he owed the moneylender 3,000 rupees. In those days, in the mid 80s, that was $300. I was appalled. I said, just $300 and he's taking your best days without any compensation? I told him, take the money from me and repay the full debt. You don't need to pay me back any interest. Just from your salary, you can cut whatever you want every month till the 3,000 is repaid. To my surprise, Hasuram refused. He said, if I pay off the money lender, he will be upset with me and I can no longer claim, I can never go back to him. So it made no sense to me. I told him that if he was debt free and liberated from supplying the labor during the critical periods, why should he not do it? He looked at me as if I ought to have understood. He said, sir, you will employ me for some more time, 1 year, 2 years, maybe 5 years, 10 if I am lucky. Who will I turn to thereafter when I need money? Unlike you, the moneylender and his family will be here for me forever. That I understand how complex things are, and I hope that you too get a sense of the complex voices of the poor and how important it is to really understand them. Thank you. It's been a pleasure interacting with you, even if it's virtual in one way, and I look forward to more opportunities.